The echo of his voice cracked through the grand living room like thunder. "You are fired!" Mr. Whitmore's finger trembled with anger as he pointed at Grace, who stood frozen near the door, still holding the damp cloth she had used to wipe the handle. The afternoon light spilled through the tall windows, painting the marble floor in streaks of gold. Behind him, Mrs. Whitmore sat pale and motionless on the couch, her lips parted but voiceless. Grace's heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't meant to do anything wrong. Moments earlier, she had touched the woman's arm, trying to steady her after a dizzy spell. It was an innocent gesture, a reflex born from compassion. But it broke an invisible rule in that house. Servants never touched their masters. Mr. Whitmore's fury was not just about the act, but the audacity of care. Grace tried to explain, but her voice came out trembling, swallowed by the silence of judgment. No one in the room dared to defend her. The ticking of a golden clock filled the pause between breaths. Grace's hands shook as she tried to apologize, but every word only made the man's face tighten. Mrs. Whitmore turned her gaze away, eyes glistening with something close to sorrow. Grace noticed the faint outline of bruises along the woman's wrist and felt her stomach twist. She wanted to say something, but she knew. In this house, truth was a dangerous thing. "Leave," he said coldly, his tone flat and final. The sound of those 4 letters cut deeper than any insult. Grace hesitated, looking at the woman she had tried to help. There was a silent plea in the lady's eyes, a flicker of gratitude that died before it reached her lips. The butler stepped forward, signaling her to move. The echo of her footsteps on the wooden floor was the only farewell she received. Outside the mansion, the autumn wind bit her cheeks. Grace clutched the blue cleaning cloth to her chest, as if it could hold her together. The heavy door shut behind her, sealing off everything she had known for years. The marble halls, the whispered orders, the faint scent of lilies that always hung in the air. For the first time, she realized how easily a life could vanish in a single word. Fired. As she walked down the driveway, memories flooded her. Laughter in the kitchen, late-night chores, the occasional soft "thank you" from the woman upstairs. Step away from the mansion felt like a step away from a part of herself. She wondered if compassion had been her mistake all along. But deep inside, she felt something unresolved, like a shadow still watching her from the windows above. Grace stopped halfway through the iron gate and turned back. Through the glass, she caught a glimpse of Mrs. Whitmore's silhouette. The woman's hand was pressed against the curtain, trembling. It was a gesture so subtle that anyone else might have missed it, but Grace saw it. A silent "I'm sorry," a silent "help me." And in that moment, the anger and shame in Grace's heart melted into something else. A promise. She whispered to herself, "Something's wrong in that house." The breeze carried her words away, but the determination in her eyes hardened. She didn't know it yet, but this day, this humiliation, was the beginning of everything. The truth had already begun to unravel, like a thread pulled from a perfect tapestry. Grace took a deep breath, her pulse sinking with the rhythm of fate. The street below the mansion felt different now, freer, colder. Grace walked toward the setting sun, her shoes crunching on the gravel, her mind racing with unanswered questions. Why had the lady looked so frightened? What were those marks on her wrist? And why did the doctors never help? A part of her wanted to forget, but another part, the part that still believed in kindness, refused to let go. That night, she would pray for peace, but instead dream of shadows whispering in marble halls. Dreams where the woman's voice called her name over and over, dreams that would soon turn into clues. Because even though Grace had been cast out, the truth was still inside that mansion, waiting for someone brave enough to see it. And Grace, though she didn't know it yet, was not done fighting. If you were in Grace's place, would you have spoken up, or stayed silent to keep your job? Don't forget to like, comment your answer and subscribe, because sometimes one small act of courage changes everything. Grace still remembered the first time she crossed the iron gates of the Whitmore mansion. The air smelled of trimmed roses and polished silver, and the house towered over her like a monument built to remind the world who ruled it. Inside, every sound seemed forbidden. Footsteps softened, whispers swallowed. Even laughter felt out of place, like a sin. The silence wasn't peace, it was control. On that first morning, the head butler, Mr. Reynolds, had handed her a small booklet of rules. No questions, no eye contact with guests, no unsolicited kindness. Efficiency, not emotion, he said, his voice as smooth as the marble beneath their feet. Grace nodded obediently, but the words sank into her like stones. She had grown up believing that kindness was a form of strength. In this house, it was weakness. Her daily routine became a rhythm of invisibility. She polished banisters, dusted chandeliers, and cleaned rooms that no one dared to enter. The staff moved like ghosts, their eyes always on the floor. At meal breaks, they spoke in fragments, careful not to mention the family upstairs. Grace often wondered what kind of life was lived behind those closed doors. What kind of loneliness money could buy. It was during her second week that she first saw Mrs. Whitmore. The woman appeared in the corridor like a shadow draped in silk. Her beauty was delicate, but her eyes carried exhaustion deeper than any sickness Grace had known. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile one gives to a stranger in a storm. "Thank you," she whispered, when Grace stepped aside to let her pass. That voice lingered long after she was gone. Rumors among the staff painted Mrs. Whitmore as fragile, a woman with a mysterious illness no doctor could name. Some said it was stress, others whispered about a curse. The husband, Mr. Whitmore, was rarely home, and when he was, his presence filled the air with cold tension. Grace noticed how every servant stiffened when he entered a room. His footsteps were enough to drain the color from their faces. At night, Grace would pass by the ladies' bedroom door and hear muffled coughing. Sometimes it was gentle, other times it sounded like she was choking on her own breath. Grace wanted to knock, to ask if she needed water, but she remembered. Rule number 5, never enter unless summoned. So she stood outside, her hand hovering over the door, paralyzed between duty and empathy. Then she'd walk away, whispering a silent prayer. Days bled into weeks, and the silence of the mansion began to weigh on her soul. Even the ticking of clocks seemed accusatory, as if reminding her that compassion had no place there. The gardeners never smiled, the maids never sang, and every sunset looked the same through the spotless windows. Grace began to feel like part of the furniture, polished and voiceless, but beneath the hush of wealth, something darker hummed. Grace noticed small inconsistencies, a new medicine bottle each week, a different doctor arriving after midnight, and servants whispering about sealed packages. Once, she caught sight of the lady's wrist, bruised like it had been held too tightly. The image stayed with her long after she turned away. Something about that house felt sick, not just the woman inside it. Then one afternoon, while dusting near the staircase, Grace overheard Mr. Whitmore speaking sharply on the phone. His voice echoed down the corridor. "I don't care what it costs. No one must know." The words froze her where she stood. He ended the call, and the silence that followed was heavier than before. Grace's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the terrible certainty that she was standing inside a secret. That night, as she lay awake in her small attic room, she realized the mansion wasn't silent because it was peaceful. It was silent because everyone inside it was afraid to speak. And fear, Grace thought, was the loudest sound of all. She didn't yet know it, But the quiet halls of that house were about to echo with the truth. And her name would be the one whispered in every corner. Every morning at 6, the mansion came alive without a single sound. Grace would rise before dawn, her shoes barely whispering across the polished floors as she carried her cleaning cart through endless corridors. The world outside was still dark, but inside the air felt heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. Every movement was measured, every sound forbidden. Even the clinking of porcelain seemed too loud for those walls. On her 3rd month working there, Grace noticed that certain rooms were always locked. The library, the west study, and most strangely, the medical room near Mrs. Whitmore's suite. Only Mr. Whitmore and a private doctor had the keys. Every week, a new set of medicine bottles appeared on a silver tray outside the lady's door, neatly labelled with numbers instead of names. It didn't feel like healing. It felt like control. Sometimes Grace would catch glimpses of the doctor, a tall man with gloves that shone under the light, always leaving through the servants' entrance after dark. He never spoke to the staff, only nodded, his eyes hidden behind glasses that reflected everything but revealed nothing. Once, she heard him whisper to Mr. Whitmore, "She doesn't need to know the side effects." The words froze her mid-step, her heart thudding in disbelief. Mrs. Whitmore's condition seemed to worsen with each visit. Her skin grew paler, her voice fainter. Yet the doctors kept coming, bringing new bottles, new promises. The mansion's staff had learned not to ask questions. Curiosity was a fire that burned whoever touched it. But Grace couldn't ignore what she saw. There was something deeply unnatural in how the lady's body reacted to her so-called treatments. One morning, while polishing the glass cabinet in the hallway, Grace noticed a bottle she hadn't seen before. Its label was peeling, the letters smudged by fingerprints. The liquid inside shimmered faintly, tinged with an odd green hue. She reached for it instinctively, but before her fingers could touch the glass, Mr. Reynolds, the butler, appeared behind her. "Never touch what isn't yours," he said softly, though his tone carried a warning sharp as a knife. After he left, Grace's reflection stared back at her from the cabinet door, pale, frightened, yet unyielding. She wondered what kind of medicine changed colour in the light. The curiosity gnawed at her, louder than fear. That night, she wrote the label's remaining letters on a scrap of paper. Eth, Som, 12. It meant nothing to her then, but it would mean everything later. She hid the note beneath her pillow, her secret beginning to grow roots. Over the next few days, Grace began to notice patterns. The doctor always arrived on Wednesdays. The lady always fell ill on Thursdays. The servants changed the sheets every Friday morning, stained with traces of sweat and something metallic. Even the flowers in Mrs. Whitmore's room, white lilies, wilted faster than anywhere else. Grace started marking dates on a small notepad, connecting dots no one else dared to see. One evening, as she carried laundry past the master's study, she heard muffled voices inside. "We can't keep this up forever," said the doctor, his tone low but urgent. Mr. Whitmore's reply was colder. "You'll keep it up as long as I pay you." There was a pause, followed by the sound of a drawer slamming shut. Grace's pulse raced as she tiptoed away, her breath shallow. Whatever they were hiding, it was destroying someone's life. That night, sleep would not come. The whisper she heard through the vents seemed to merge with the ticking of her clock, forming a rhythm of warning. Grace turned in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if compassion could be a sin in such a place. Every instinct told her to stay silent, to survive. But her heart, stubborn and untrained in fear, told her that silence was the first step toward guilt. By the next morning, Grace made a quiet decision. If no one else would see what was happening, she would. She would clean slower, listen harder, and remember everything. because something inside that mansion, behind the polished doors and the gleaming silver, was rotting, and Grace was beginning to understand that some secrets, once noticed, never let you rest again. It happened on an afternoon when the air smelled faintly of rain. Grace had been assigned to bring tea to Mrs. Whitmore's quarters, a rare privilege, since most servants were forbidden from entering. The door creaked softly as she stepped inside, her breath catching at the sight. The room was dim, curtains drawn to block the sun, filled with the sterile scent of medicine and fading flowers. In the corner, Mrs. Whitmore sat by the window, wrapped in a pale shawl. For a moment Grace thought she might have been sleeping, but then the woman's eyes opened, grey and glassy, and a soft voice broke the stillness. "You're the new maid, aren't you?" Her tone carried both fragility and grace, the kind that made people instinctively lower their voices. Grace nodded quickly, setting the silver tray on the side table. "Yes, ma'am. Just some chamomile tea." She tried to smile, but her nerves made her voice tremble. Mrs. Whitmore's gaze lingered on her face, as if studying a memory. "You're kind," she said quietly. "Most here have forgotten what that looks like." The words struck Grace like a gentle wind, both comforting and heartbreaking. No one in the house ever spoke with warmth. For a few seconds, the mansion's walls seemed to soften, and Grace felt seen, not as a servant, but as another human being. It was the first warmth she'd felt since arriving. When Grace reached to place the cup in the woman's hands, their fingers brushed. The contact was brief, but enough for Grace to notice something unsettling. The lady's skin was ice-cold and marked by faint, symmetrical bruises circling her wrist. They weren't the kind of marks illness left behind. Mrs. Whitmore quickly pulled her sleeve down, forcing a weak smile. "The treatments," she murmured. "They make me fragile." Grace hesitated, her throat tightening with questions she wasn't allowed to ask. "Do they help you feel better?" she whispered instead. The woman looked away, eyes unfocused. "They help my husband sleep at night," she said softly. The answer made Grace's stomach twist. There was resignation in her tone, not relief. As she turned back to her tea, Grace noticed her hands trembling slightly, not from weakness but fear. After that day, Grace was assigned to Mrs. Whitmore's room more often. Perhaps the lady had requested her. Perhaps fate had simply intervened. Each visit brought small, stolen moments of conversation. They spoke of the garden, the changing seasons, the sound of rain on the windows. Grace learned that Mrs. Whitmore loved lilies because they reminded her of peace, though lately, she confessed, she couldn't stand their smell. "It feels like hospitals," she said with a sad smile. One afternoon, Grace found her gazing at an old photograph on the vanity, a younger version of herself, vibrant and alive, standing beside her husband. "He used to smile," the woman whispered, tracing the edge of the frame. "We both did." Grace didn't know what to say. She wanted to ask what had changed, but the sorrow in the woman's eyes answered before words could. Sometimes silence spoke louder than comfort. The more time Grace spent there, the more she sensed how much fear haunted that room. The windows were always closed, the curtains drawn tight, the air stale from disuse. Mrs. Whitmore often flinched at sudden sounds, the creak of a door, the footsteps of her husband in the hallway. Once, when Mr. Whitmore entered unannounced, Grace felt the temperature in the room drop. His presence was sharp enough to cut. After he left, Mrs. Whitmore's hands trembled too much to hold her cup. Grace knelt to steady it, her heart breaking at the sight. "You're too good," the woman whispered through tears. "People like you don't last long here." Grace wanted to protest, to say she wasn't afraid, but her voice caught in her throat. Somewhere deep down, she knew the warning was true. Kindness in that house was a dangerous act. That night, as Grace lay awake, she could still feel the coldness of Mrs. Whitmore's skin on her fingertips. The bruises, the trembling, the fearful glance toward the door, they played in her mind like a haunting melody. She didn't yet understand what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain. That woman wasn't dying from a disease. She was fading from something, or someone, much darker. The garden behind the Whitmore mansion was the only place that still felt alive. Rows of lilies and hydrangeas swayed in the soft evening breeze, their petals glowing under the fading sunlight. Grace often volunteered to tend the flowers, not because it was her duty, but because it was the only space where silence didn't feel suffocating. The air carried whispers of freedom that the mansion walls refused to allow. Out here, she could breathe again. One evening, while trimming wilted blooms near the fountain, Grace heard hushed voices from the hedge nearby. It was two of the younger maids, their tones sharp with fear. "She's getting worse," one said. "They changed her medicine again." The other replied, "My cousin says those bottles come from some private lab, not even licensed." Their words sank into Grace's mind like stones into still water. The rumors were spreading faster than the truth. Grace stayed perfectly still, pretending to be focused on the flowers. "They say the illness started after Mr. Whitmore's last business trip," one of them continued, lowering her voice. "Something about a deal gone wrong, some experimental drug." The other maid shushed her quickly, glancing around. "Don't speak of it there. The walls have ears." The sound of their footsteps faded, leaving Grace alone with her racing thoughts and the chirping of crickets. She knelt by the fountain, dipping her hands into the cold water, trying to calm her pulse. Could the medicine really be harming Mrs. Whitmore? The idea seemed impossible. Doctors were supposed to heal, not harm. Yet the bruises, the trembling, the sleepless nights, all of it pointed towards something unnatural. Grace looked at her reflection in the water, seeing not a maid, but a witness. Someone who had seen too much to pretend anymore. Later that week, Mrs. Whitmore asked for her to bring fresh lilies to her room. As Grace arranged them by the bedside, the woman frowned faintly. "They smell stronger lately," she whispered, "almost metallic." Grace froze. Metallic. The same scent she'd noticed near the medicine bottles. "Maybe it's just the air," Grace said softly, though her heart knew otherwise. The woman nodded, but her eyes looked far away, clouded with silent dread. That night, the staff was called into the main hall for an announcement. Mr. Whitmore stood at the staircase, stern and composed. "My wife's condition has worsened," he said, "and from now on, no one except the doctor and myself will enter her quarters without permission." The servants murmured quietly, exchanging nervous glances. Grace's stomach dropped. The door that had allowed her small moments of kindness was now sealed by fear. The days that followed felt longer, colder. Grace still worked in the garden, but her heart was chained to that locked room upstairs. Every morning she'd glance at the window where Mrs. Whitmore once stood, and each day it remained closed. Sometimes she thought she saw a shadow move behind the curtains, slow, weak, and alone. She wanted to believe the woman was still alive. She needed to believe it. Then one morning, as Grace trimmed the roses, she noticed the butler carrying a black bag toward the side entrance, the same one the doctor used. He glanced around before disappearing inside. Minutes later, a faint sound echoed from above. Not quite a scream, not quite a cry, but something in between. The garden, once full of birds, fell utterly silent. Even the wind seemed to stop breathing. That evening, the younger maid who'd whispered by the hedge approached Grace in secret. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. "You didn't hear this from me," she said, "but I saw the doctor injecting her with something yesterday. She fainted before he finished." Grace's blood ran cold. The image flashed in her mind. The trembling hands, the metallic scent, the bruises that never healed. None of it was coincidence anymore. As night fell, Grace stood alone in the garden, staring at the mansion glowing faintly under the moonlight. Its windows gleamed like eyes. Beautiful, empty, watchful. The flowers around her swayed gently, their petals whispering in the wind. Grace closed her eyes and whispered back, "Hold on, ma'am. Please, hold on." Deep down, she knew she couldn't stay silent much longer. The garden's peace had become her witness and her promise. The master's study was the only room Grace feared cleaning. It carried a strange stillness, as if the air itself knew to stay quiet. Heavy books lined the shelves, their leather spines glinting beneath the amber light. The smell of cigar smoke lingered in the curtains, mixed with something colder, something metallic, almost sterile. Every Wednesday, she was ordered to dust, polish, and leave without lingering. But that day, something felt different. The rain outside struck the tall windows in slow, rhythmic taps. Grace was polishing the mahogany desk when she noticed one of its drawers was slightly open. A faint glimmer caught her eye. Papers, edges frayed, stacked in uneven piles. She glanced toward the door. No footsteps, no voices. The silence was an invitation wrapped in danger. Her hand trembled as she slid the drawer open another inch. Inside lay a folder bound with red string. The label read, "Whitmore Biotech, Phase 3 Testing." Beneath it, she saw dozens of receipts, medical invoices, and small glass vials half filled with pale fluid. There were names written beside each file, some crossed out, some marked terminated. Grace's breath quickened. She didn't understand every word, but she understood enough to feel dread crawling up her spine. This wasn't medicine. It was experimentation. Her eyes landed on a single sheet tucked at the bottom, a report signed by Mr. Whitmore himself. Subject shows signs of hormonal disorientation. Continue dosage. Monitor cardiac response. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. Subject. The word stripped away every trace of humanity. She didn't need a name to know who it referred to. Mrs. Whitmore wasn't being treated. She was being tested. A noise outside the door made her flinch. The sound of footsteps, deliberate, heavy, drawing closer. Grace shoved the papers back, her fingers fumbling with the red string. The folder caught on the edge of the drawer, tearing slightly. She managed to push it closed, just as the handle turned. Her pulse throbbed in hearers. Mr. Reynolds, the butler, entered with his usual calm expression. "Is everything all right, Miss Grace?" he asked, eyes colder than his tone. "Yes, sir," she replied, forcing her voice steady. Her palms were slick with sweat, her mind racing. He studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Good. Remember, curiosity is dangerous in this house." Then he left, the echo of his shoes fading like a warning whispered into the walls. Grace waited until she was sure he was gone before exhaling the breath she'd been holding. Her knees felt weak, but her resolve grew stronger. As she wiped the desk again to hide any trace of her trembling hands, something slipped out from under a paperweight. A small photograph. It showed Mrs. Whitmore smiling in a sunlit garden, her eyes alive with color and warmth. The photo felt out of place in this cold room. Grace hesitated, then slipped it into her apron pocket. It wasn't theft. It was proof that the woman she saw fading upstairs had once truly lived. When her shift ended, Grace returned to her small attic room, locking the door behind her. She pulled out the photograph and placed it on her bed, staring at it under the dim lamplight. "What did they do to you?" she whispered. The woman's smile seemed to answer nothing and everything at once. Grace folded the photo carefully, hiding it beneath her pillow, as if protecting it could somehow protect the truth. That night, thunder rolled above the mansion, shaking the windows. Grace lay, awake, her mind replaying every detail she had seen, the files, the vials, the cruel precision of the reports. Each image burned behind her eyes, impossible to forget. Outside, lightning illuminated the sky, briefly casting shadows across her room. For a heartbeat, it looked as though someone was standing by her door. She sat up, but when the light faded, there was only silence. And in that silence, Grace made a promise. She would find out what those papers truly meant. She would uncover what no doctor had dared to say aloud, because somewhere behind the polished glass and quiet wealth, someone was dying, not from illness, but from deceit. And Grace, trembling yet unbroken, was the only one who had seen the first piece of the truth. The next morning dawned grey and heavy, as if the sky itself carried the weight of secrets. Grace moved through her chores with trembling hands, still haunted by what she'd seen in the forbidden drawer. Every sound in the mansion felt sharper, every glance heavier. She avoided the butler's eyes, though she could feel his quiet suspicion follow her like a shadow. Something inside her whispered that danger was coming, not softly, but fast. By midday, the mansion was alive with tension. A door slammed somewhere down the hall, followed by the echo of raised voices. Grace froze as Mr. Whitmore's footsteps thundered through the corridor, each one louder than the last. He stopped at the entrance to the study, the same door she had dared to open the day before. "Grace," he called, his tone dangerously calm. "Come here." Her breath caught. She had no choice but to obey. When she stepped into the study, the air was thick with cigar smoke and accusation. Mr. Whitmore stood by his desk, one hand resting on the drawer she'd opened. "Someone has been in my private files," he said, his voice low and deliberate. Grace's knees nearly buckled. "Was it you?" The question sliced through her composure like a blade. She wanted to lie, to protect herself, but truth trembled on her lips, fragile and reckless. I was cleaning, sir. The drawer was open." His eyes narrowed. "You're lying." He circled her like a predator, the smell of tobacco heavy between them. "You think I don't notice when a servant touches what isn't hers?" Grace's heart pounded so loud she could hear it in her ears. "No, sir," she whispered. "I meant no harm." But the words sounded small, hollow. He leaned closer, his voice turning colder. "Curiosity ruins good workers, Grace. Don't let it ruin you." She kept her gaze on the floor, hands clasped tight to stop them from shaking. "Something's wrong with the medicine," she said suddenly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Silence filled the room like a held breath. Mr. Whitmore's expression froze, then hardened. "What did you say?" Grace's throat went dry. "Your wife. She's not getting better. The treatments, they're making her weaker." Her courage felt like glass, fragile, but clear. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw doubt flicker in his eyes. But it vanished as quickly as it came. He straightened his coat and spoke with quiet venom. "You will never speak of my wife again. Do you understand?" Grace opened her mouth to protest, but his hand slammed against the desk, making her flinch. The sound echoed through the study like a gunshot. "Get out," he said, "before I make you regret every word." She stumbled out, her vision blurred with tears. In the hallway, the other servants pretended not to see her, their faces blank with fear. Mr. Reynolds appeared moments later, his tone soft but unkind. "You've crossed a line, Miss Grace. Consider this your final warning." Grace nodded weakly, her throat burning. As she walked away, she could feel the mansion itself watching her, each polished surface reflecting her guilt back at her. That evening, she lingered by the servants' quarters, listening to whispers drift through the corridors. "He's furious," one maid murmured. "He said she's dangerous." "Dangerous," another echoed. "For what? Telling the truth." Grace pressed her back against the wall, closing her eyes. The truth was now her crime. And in a house built on lies, crimes were never forgiven. Somewhere above, she heard Mrs. Whitmore coughing. a hollow, desperate sound that tore through the silence. Later that night, as she lay awake, Grace realized the full cost of what she'd done. She had spoken out, not in defiance, but in compassion. And now, the mansion was turning against her. Shadows seemed to gather thicker near her door. She thought she heard footsteps stop just outside, lingering, then moving on. Sleep never came. The storm outside rattled the windows, but the greater storm was already inside the house. When morning arrived, the world felt colder. The staff moved like actors in a play they no longer wanted to perform. Mr. Whitmore didn't look at her during breakfast, but his silence said enough. Grace finished her tasks with mechanical precision, her mind racing. She'd glimpsed the truth, and truth once seen could not be unseen. She didn't know it yet, but the next time she tried to help, the price would be far worse than fear. The days that followed were a blur of silence and suspicion. Her chores like a shadow, careful not to draw attention, yet her mind never stopped replaying the words she had seen on those papers, the cruel language of science used to disguise suffering. Every sound in the mansion felt amplified, the hum of lights, the creak of the floors, even her own breathing. She knew she was being watched, but curiosity was stronger than fear. One morning, as she dusted the nightstand in Mrs. Whitmore's room, Grace noticed something unusual. A small white bottle stood apart from the rest, its cap slightly crooked. When she lifted it, a faint metallic scent reached her nose, the same smell she'd sensed in the garden, in the lilies, in the room's still air. The label was missing entirely, scraped clean. Her pulse quickened. She uncapped it carefully and poured one tablet into her palm. It shimmered faintly, almost iridescent. Footsteps approached. She quickly slipped the pill into her apron pocket and replaced the bottle exactly as she'd found it. The butler entered a moment later, carrying a tray of new medicine. "Everything in order?" he asked, his eyes cold and assessing. "Yes, sir," Grace said, forcing her hands to remain steady. He lingered a moment, then left. Grace exhaled slowly, her heart pounding. Whatever these pills were, they weren't medicine meant to heal. That night, when her shift ended, Grace left the mansion quietly through the rain-soaked streets to a small pharmacy on the edge of town. The owner, an elderly man with kind eyes, looked up as she entered. "Evening, miss," he said. Grace hesitated before pulling the tablet from her pocket. "It's for a friend," she whispered. "She's been taking this, but I'm not sure what it is." He frowned, adjusting his glasses, and studied the pill under the light. "This isn't any over-the-counter medicine," he said after a long pause. "It's a compound used in hormone suppression trials, experimental, restricted." Grace's stomach turned. "Trials?" she asked. "What does it do?" The man sighed heavily. "In high doses it damages the nervous system, causes fatigue, memory loss, even paralysis." Grace's hands went cold. Why would anyone give this to someone who's not ill? The pharmacist looked up, confusion written on his face. No doctor would, not legally. She thanked him and hurried out before he could ask more. The rain had grown heavier, drumming against her shoulders, soaking her uniform. She walked fast, almost running, her mind spinning with dread. The medicine wasn't curing Mrs. Whitmore. It was destroying her from within. Grace stopped under a flickering street lamp, clutching the small paper bag that now felt like evidence. "Oh, God," she whispered. "He's killing her." Back at the mansion, the lights were still on. Through the window, she saw Mr. Whitmore speaking with the doctor, the same man with cold eyes and spotless gloves. They stood close, whispering, the air between them tense. The doctor handed him a folder which Mr. Whitmore tucked away in his coat. Grace pressed herself against the wall, hidden in the shadows, Even from a distance, she could see the smirk on the doctor's face. Business as usual. When she finally crept to her room, Grace spread the paper bag and the note from weeks ago on her bed. The letters she had written, Eth Som 12, matched the code stamped faintly on the side of the pill, her suspicions aligned like puzzle pieces. Phase 3 testing, subject, hormone suppression. Every word she had read, every bruise she had seen, now made perfect sense. It wasn't illness, it was control. The realization stole her breath. Tears blurred her vision as she thought of Mrs. Whitmore lying upstairs, trapped between poison and silence. Grace pressed her hands together, praying not for herself, but for the strength to act. "If no one believes me," she whispered, "then I'll make them see." The wind rattled her window as if echoing her resolve. The truth was dangerous, but doing nothing was worse. She would confront him. She had no choice left. And as thunder rolled across the night sky, Grace looked out toward the mansion, its windows glowing faintly through the rain. Somewhere behind those walls, lies were being written as prescriptions, and love was being used as a weapon. She straightened her shoulders, gripping the photo in her pocket for courage. Tomorrow she would face him. Tomorrow the silence would break. The storm had not passed when Grace returned to the mansion the next morning. Clouds hung low over the estate, turning the marble walls into slabs of grey. She moved through her chores like someone carrying a secret too heavy to hide. The servants avoided her. Whispers followed her down the hall. Everyone seemed to sense that something was about to shatter. They just didn't know she would be the one to strike the first blow. Grace waited until Mr. Whitmore's study door was slightly ajar, the sound of his pen scratching paper faint through the gap. Her heart pounded as she stepped inside, clutching the folded pharmacy note in her hand. "Sir," she began, her voice trembling but clear. He didn't look up. "I need to speak to you about your wife's medicine." The pen stopped mid-stroke. Slowly he lifted his eyes. The silence that followed was suffocating. "What about it?" he asked, his tone calm but edged like broken glass. Grace forced herself to meet his gaze. "It's not medicine. It's a chemical compound used in trials. The pharmacist confirmed it. It's poisoning her." Mr. Whitmore's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened, as though a shadow had passed behind them. "You overstep again," he said softly. "You speak of things you don't understand." "I understand enough," Grace said, her voice stronger now. "Your wife is dying, and you're letting it happen." The words hung between them, trembling like a struck chord. Mr. Whitmore rose from his chair, his height imposing, his anger quiet and controlled. "You think you can accuse me, a man of my standing, with rumors and foolish notions?" he said. "Do you have any idea what you're risking?" Grace took a step back, but didn't flinch. "Her life," she said. "That's what I'm risking." For the first time, his composure cracked, his jaw tightened, and he slammed his fist against the desk, making the lamp flicker. "You don't know what I've done for her," he shouted. The rawness in his voice startled her. For a moment he almost sounded human, desperate, not cruel. But then the mask returned. "Leave," he ordered, his tone icy once more. "Before you say something you'll regret." "I already regret staying silent," Grace whispered. She reached into her pocket and placed the pill on the desk, the small tablet gleaming under the light. "This is what's killing her." He stared at it, unmoving, like a man staring at his own reflection. Then he swept it off the table, his voice low and venomous. "Get out of my house!" The words struck like a whip. Grace didn't move. "Please," she said, tears burning her eyes. "If you won't listen to me, at least call another doctor." "Mrs." Whitmore's voice came suddenly from the doorway, weak, trembling. "What's happening?" Both turned. She stood there, holding onto the frame for balance, her skin pale as candle wax. "Grace," she whispered, "why are you crying?" Grace took a step toward her, but Mr. Whitmore blocked her path. "Back to your room," he ordered. "Now." The woman's knees buckled, and before anyone could move, she collapsed. The sound of her body hitting the floor shattered whatever calm was left. Grace rushed forward, kneeling beside her, cradling her head. "Call someone!" she shouted. The butler appeared, frozen in the doorway, torn between orders and conscience. "Do something!" she screamed again. Mr. Whitmore stood motionless, staring at his wife, like a man seeing his sins made flesh. Finally, he turned away. "Take her upstairs," he muttered. "I'll handle this." Grace's hands shook as she helped the others lift Mrs. Whitmore. The woman's breath came shallow, her eyelids fluttering like paper in the wind. "Hold on," Grace whispered, her tears falling freely now. "Please, just hold on." As they carried her back to her room, Grace glanced over her shoulder. Mr. Whitmore stood at the base of the stairs, his face unreadable, his hand clenched around the edge of the banister. He looked less like a husband and more like a man cornered by the truth. When the room was cleared, Grace sat by the bedside, refusing to leave. The doctor hadn't yet arrived, and the mansion was filled with restless silence. Outside, thunder rolled over the hills, distant but constant. Mrs. Whitmore stirred faintly, her lips moving in broken words. "He said it would save me," she whispered. Grace leaned closer, her heart splintering. "He lied," she said softly, "but I won't." Downstairs, voices rose again. The doctor had returned, his tone sharp and panicked. Grace wiped her tears and stood, her resolve turning to steel. Whatever happened next, she could no longer pretend. She had seen too much, lost too much, and the truth was burning inside her like fire. As the door slammed below, she looked toward the window. The storm outside had reached its peak, but for Grace, it was only beginning. Dawn crept slowly over the estate, painting the world in shades of ash. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind was heavier than thunder. Grace stood outside the mansion gates, her apron damp with rain and tears. She had been dismissed before sunrise. No shouting, no farewell, only the butler's cold command to leave at once. The door had closed behind her like the ceiling of a tomb. Her footsteps echoed down the empty drive, each one a reminder of what she had lost. She carried nothing but her coat and the photograph of Mrs. Whitmore, folded safely in her pocket. The sky was pale, washed clean, but the world felt dimmer than ever. Grace's body trembled from exhaustion, but her mind refused to rest. "She's still alive," she whispered. "She has to be." The words gave her enough strength to keep walking. By the time she reached the edge of town, her shoes were soaked and her hands numb. She found shelter beneath the awning of a closed bakery, sinking onto the cold stone steps. For the first time in years, she had nowhere to go. The city beyond the hills seemed impossibly far, and yet the mansion's shadow still stretched across her heart. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the woman's face, pale and pleading. She stayed there until morning traffic began to stir, the distant clatter of carts and the soft murmur of voices. Somewhere, normal life continued. People buying bread, children laughing, the world spinning as if no one had just been poisoned behind marble walls. Grace felt invisible, a ghost wandering between two worlds, the one that didn't care and the one that had broken her. Maybe that's why they get away with it, she thought, because no one looks long enough to see. Later that day, she walked to the small church on the corner, the same one she used to pass on her way to work. Its doors were open, the scent of incense drifting out into the cold air. She slipped inside, sitting at the back pew. Candles flickered near the altar, their light fragile but persistent. She bowed her head, fingers clasped tightly. "If I was wrong, forgive me," she whispered. "But if I was right, please show me what to do." Her prayer was met with silence, yet she felt something shift. not a voice, but a quiet conviction rising within her. When she opened her eyes, the sunlight through the stained glass painted her face in colors. Red, gold, blue. For the first time since leaving the mansion, she didn't feel small. She felt chosen in a strange, painful way. Truth had found her, and it demanded to be carried, even if no one else believed. She left the church and wandered the streets until dusk. The world around her blurred into motion, strangers passing, wheels turning, life resuming. But inside her mind, everything replayed in slow motion. The bruises, the fainting, the doctor's eyes, the files marked Phase 3. It all fit together too perfectly to be coincidence. "He's hiding something," she murmured, "and she's paying the price." The thought hardened that night. Resolve. In the small room she rented above a tailor's shop, Grace laid out her evidence on the table. The torn note, the single pill, the photograph. She lit a candle, its flame trembling in the dark. "They can call me crazy," she whispered, "but I won't let this die with me." The light reflected in her eyes, fierce and unyielding. Every breath she took felt like a promise that truth, once seen, would never again be buried. Outside, the wind howled through the streets, carrying the faint toll of distant church bells. Grace stared out the window, her reflection pale against the glass. Somewhere in that mansion, Mrs. Whitmore still breathed, a prisoner of silence and greed. Grace's hand closed around the photo. "Hold on," she said softly. "I'm not done yet." And for the first time since her dismissal, she didn't feel helpless. She felt ready. By morning, her plan had already begun to take shape. The note from the pharmacist, the testimony she could gather, the nurse who had once worked for the Whitmores. There were threads she could pull, voices she could find. The mansion had cast her out, but it hadn't silenced her. As the sun rose over the rooftops, Grace felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Purpose, quiet, trembling but alive. 3 days passed before Grace heard the knock on her door. It was soft, hesitant, almost frightened. When she opened it, a woman stood there, older, weary, her nurse's uniform tucked beneath a faded coat. "Are you Grace?" she asked. Her voice was hoarse, like someone who hadn't spoken the truth in years. Grace nodded, stepping aside. The woman entered slowly, her eyes darting toward the window, as if afraid of being followed. "My name is Clara," she said, sitting down at the small wooden table. "I worked for the Whitmores years ago." Grace's heart skipped. "You took care of Mrs. Whitmore?" The woman nodded, her hands trembling as she removed a folded letter from her coat. "I did, until I couldn't anymore." She slid the letter across the table. The paper was worn, the ink smudged. "This is her medical file. I kept it when they told me to destroy it." Grace unfolded the pages carefully, her eyes scanning the lines. Drug dosages, hormone data, side effects. The words blurred together until she reached one phrase that made her gasp. "Patient shows resistance to treatment. Increase. Dosage immediately." Clara looked down, guilt shadowing her face. "He paid us well," she whispered. "Said it was experimental therapy. But when she started losing her memory, I knew something was wrong." Grace's throat tightened. "Why didn't you say anything?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Because I tried once," she said. "And the next morning, my husband was fired from his job without explanation. We had 2 children. I stayed quiet. I thought I could live with that." Her voice cracked. "But I can't anymore. I see her face every night." Grace reached across the table, taking her hand. "Then help me make it right." They spent hours piecing through the documents. Clara explained how Mr. Whitmore had funded a private laboratory, testing compounds that mimicked hormone manipulation, all in pursuit of a patent. "She was never supposed to be a test subject," Clara said, But when the first trials failed, he turned to her, said it was the only way to save his company. Grace's stomach twisted, so he poisoned his wife to protect his empire. Clara nodded slowly. He called it sacrifice. By nightfall, the candlelight flickered over their tired faces. Grace could feel her anger hardening into resolve. "We can take this to the authorities," she said. "They'll have to listen." But Clara shook her head. "Not yet. They'll bury it if we go too soon." She hesitated, then whispered, "You need proof from inside the mansion. Something that ties his name directly to the experiments." Grace froze. The idea terrified her, but she knew Clara was right. The next morning, Grace stood outside the mansion gates again, her heart pounding. The sky was heavy with mist, the iron bars cold beneath her hands. She had come here with nothing but courage once before, and lost everything. Now she returned, armed with truth. The guard at the entrance recognized her immediately. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. "Please," she whispered, "just tell Mrs. Whitmore I'm here. Tell her Grace needs to see her." The man hesitated, then turned away. Minutes stretched into eternity before the front door opened. Mr. Reynolds appeared, his expression carved from stone. "You don't know when to quit, do you?" Grace met his gaze. "Not until she's safe." The butler's eyes narrowed. "She's resting," he said. "She doesn't need you filling her head with nonsense." Grace took a step forward, her voice trembling with quiet fury. "What she doesn't need," she said, "is another dose." He moved closer, lowering his voice. "If you know what's good for you, you'll leave and never come back." Grace stared past him toward the windows, half expecting to see a familiar silhouette watching, but the curtains were drawn tight. "You can threaten me," she whispered, "but the truth is already out there." For a flicker of a second, she saw something behind his stoic calm. Fear. Then he stepped aside. "Go home, Miss Grace," he said, "before the master returns." As she turned to leave, Grace's legs felt weak, but her heart burned with certainty. The mansion no longer scared her, it disgusted her. Each stone, each polished window was built on deceit. She looked back one last time, the fog curling around the iron gates like breath. "I'll come back," she whispered, "and next time I won't be alone." The wind carried her words away, but she didn't need to hear them. She had already crossed the point of no return. That night, Grace and Clara sat together again, studying every name, every signature, every chemical note. And when they found the final document, one bearing Mr. Whitmore's initials beside the phrase, "Approved for home testing," the room fell silent. Grace's hands trembled as she traced the letters. "This is it," she said softly. "This is what they can't deny." Clara looked at her, tears glistening. "Then it's time," she whispered. Time to end his silence. The mansion loomed against the dusk, its windows glowing faintly like eyes that refused to close. Grace stood before the gates once more, her breath visible in the cold evening air. She clutched the folder of documents to her chest, its edges damp from fog. Behind her, Clara waited in a parked car across the street, her silhouette tense behind the glass. "Are you sure?" she'd asked before Grace stepped out. Grace had nodded. "I can't let her die there." The iron gates groaned open under the guard's reluctant hand. He looked uneasy, as if some part of him already sensed what was coming. Grace entered quietly, her shoes pressing into the gravel path she knew so well. Every step echoed memories, laughter that once lived here, whispers that turned to screams. She wasn't a maid anymore, she was a witness returning to the scene of a crime, and this time she wasn't leaving empty-handed. Inside, the mansion was dim and still. Most of the servants had gone home, leaving only the faint hum of electricity and the distant rustle of wind through the curtains. Grace moved down the corridor with practiced silence, clutching the evidence beneath her coat. She could hear her heartbeat louder than her footsteps. Somewhere above, a floorboard creaked. Someone was awake, and she prayed it was the right person. When she reached the grand staircase, her gaze lifted toward the landing. Mrs. Whitmore's bedroom door stood ajar. A soft light glowed within, pale and steady. Grace hesitated, her fingers trembling on the banister. She whispered to herself, "Please still be alive." Then she climbed the stairs, each step a test of courage. The scent of medicine hung faintly in the air, mixed with something sweet, lavender perhaps, or memory. Inside the room, Mrs. Whitmore lay propped against the pillows, her body thinner, her skin almost translucent beneath the lamplight. Her eyes fluttered open at the sound of the door. "Grace," she breathed, disbelief and relief tangled in her voice. Grace rushed to her side, taking her cold hand gently. "I came back," she whispered. "You shouldn't have," the woman murmured weakly. "I know," Grace interrupted softly, "but he's gone too far." She opened the folder on the bedside table, spreading the papers one by one. The signatures, the lab reports, the order forms. Mrs. Whitmore stared at them as though they were written in another language. "He did this," she whispered. Grace nodded, her voice trembling. "All of it. You were never sick. He's been using you to test his company's drug." The woman closed her eyes, a tear sliding down her cheek. "I thought I was losing my mind," she whispered. But it was him. A sound from the hallway made them both freeze. The unmistakable rhythm of polished shoes against wood. Mr. Whitmore's voice followed, low and sharp. "I know you're in there." Grace turned toward the door, her pulse quickening. She could see his shadow stretching across the floor as he approached. "Stay quiet," she whispered to the woman, stepping protectively in front of her. The handle turned. The door opened. He entered slowly, his eyes immediately finding the open folder on the table. For a long moment no one spoke. The air crackled with quiet fury. "You never learn, do you?" he said finally. "You had your chance to disappear." Grace's voice didn't shake. "You should have saved her instead." His jaw tightened. "You think you're saving her now? You're destroying everything I built." "Maybe it deserves to fall," she answered. Her courage no longer felt borrowed. It was hers. He took a step forward, his shadow swallowing hers. "You don't understand what it takes to keep this empire alive," he hissed. "Sacrifices must be made." Grace stared at him, tears glinting in her eyes. "Not like this," she said. "Not someone who trusted you." Behind her, Mrs. Whitmore's faint voice broke the tension. "Stop." The word was barely a whisper, but it froze him in place. When he turned toward her, she was sitting upright, her eyes filled with quiet fire. "Enough," she said, her voice steadier than it had been in years. "No more lies." Her husband's face twisted, not in guilt but in disbelief, as though the illusion of his control had finally cracked. He looked between the two women, the truth laid bare before him. Grace stepped closer to the bed, her hand resting gently on Mrs. Whitmore's shoulder. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered, and for the first time the woman smiled, faintly, painfully, but free. The morning light crept cautiously through the curtains, revealing the mansion's cracks. Dust on the banisters, torn papers scattered across the study floor. A silence that felt like confession. The night had ended in chaos. Mr. Whitmore's rage had given way to panic, his threats dissolving under the weight of evidence spread across the room. When the doctor arrived unexpectedly, expecting secrecy, he found only exposure. Grace stood there, calm but trembling, holding truth like a weapon. Mrs. Whitmore had refused more medicine, her voice weak but unshakable. "No more," she said, as the doctor approached with his syringe. He froze when she mentioned the lab reports, her husband's signature, and the hidden trials. Grace watched the man's face drain of color. For a moment, he looked at Mr. Whitmore as if realizing that loyalty no longer guaranteed safety. "You told me she wouldn't find out," he whispered. "You said she'd die before that." The word shattered what little defense remained. It happened quickly after that. The doctor fled, taking his bag and leaving behind the very evidence he once protected. Grace gathered the papers, her hands steady now. Mr. Whitmore tried to stop her, but his wife's voice rose again, hoarse, defiant. "Let her go." He turned toward her, disbelief etched across his face. "After everything I've done for you." "For me," she interrupted, tears in her eyes. "You did this for your pride. You destroyed me to keep your name clean." Grace helped her sit upright, the morning light catching the silver strands in her hair. The woman looked fragile but alive in a way Grace had never seen before. "We're leaving," she said quietly. Mr. Whitmore took a step forward, but his voice faltered. "Where will you go?" "Anywhere that isn't here," she replied. Her tone was final. Grace didn't speak. She only held the woman's arm, steadying her as they rose together, maid and mistress, equal in suffering and courage. When they reached the doorway, Mr. Whitmore's fury collapsed into desperation. "You can't just walk away," he said, his voice cracking. "The world won't believe you." Grace turned back, her expression calm. "It doesn't have to," she said. "The truth doesn't need belief to exist." He stared at her as if seeing her for the first time, not a servant, but a storm he could no longer contain. For the first time, it was he who looked small in his own house. Outside, the morning sun was brighter than Grace remembered. She helped Mrs. Whitmore into the car that Clara had brought, the nurse waiting with quiet tears in her eyes. The woman leaned back against the seat, breathing deeply, as though tasting freedom for the first time in years. Grace looked up at the mansion one last time. Its grand windows reflected the light, dazzling but hollow. The house that had once seemed immortal now looked fragile, as if it could crumble under truth alone. By afternoon, the hospital room was filled with doctors, real ones this time, studying the samples Grace had brought. Their faces shifted from confusion to horror as they read the reports. "This compound, it's toxic," one murmured. "No licensed physician would prescribe this." Mrs. Whitmore listened quietly, her eyes closed as if she had known all along. When one of them asked how she had survived this long, Grace answered softly, "Because she kept hoping someone would finally see." The tests confirmed everything. The drug had caused severe hormonal damage and neurological decline, masked by carefully falsified reports. Mr. Whitmore's name appeared on nearly every authorization form. Grace stood by the window as police officers arrived at the hospital, her reflection pale against the glass. She didn't feel triumph, only exhaustion. Justice was beginning, but it came at the cost of too much innocence. Later, when the officers escorted Mr. Whitmore through the hospital corridors, his eyes briefly met Grace's. There was no anger left in them, only something hollow, the look of a man who finally understood the ruin his own hands had built. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence between them said everything. His power had always been borrowed, and truth had finally called in its debt. That evening Grace sat by Mrs. Whitmore's bedside as the woman drifted into quiet sleep. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and rain from the open window. For the first time in months, the air around them felt clean. Grace brushed a stray hair from the woman's forehead, whispering, "You're safe now." Outside, the city hummed softly, not in fear or deceit, but in peace. The storm had broken, and once the light didn't hurt anymore, weeks passed, and the scandal spread like wildfire. The Whitmore name, once synonymous with wealth and prestige, now filled the newspapers for reasons no fortune could silence. Headlines screamed of betrayal, human testing, and greed disguised as science. Grace watched the chaos unfold from a distance, her face appearing in none of the reports, but her courage, though unnamed, echoed through every story. The truth had found its voice at last. When the court summoned her to testify, Grace almost refused. She hated the idea of standing before a room full of strangers, her words dissected like evidence. But Clara's hand on her shoulder steadied her. "You're the only one who can speak for her," the nurse said softly. And so, on the morning of the trial, Grace walked through the courthouse doors, the folder of documents pressed tightly against her chest like a shield made of paper and faith. The courtroom was colder than she imagined. Marble floors, polished benches, the faint buzz of murmured anticipation. Mr. Whitmore sat at the defense table, surrounded by lawyers in dark suits. He looked smaller now, older, the confidence stripped from his face. When his eyes met Grace's, she saw no anger, only fatigue, the kind that comes when the lies finally collapse under their own weight. For a moment, she almost pitied him. Almost. When her name was called, Grace stepped forward and took the stand. Her palms were damp, her voice quiet but unwavering. The prosecutor asked her to describe everything: the medicine, the bruises, the documents, the night of the confrontation. Each word she spoke carried the weight of months of fear and silence. As she recounted the moment she realized Mrs. Whitmore was being poisoned, the courtroom fell utterly still. Even the air seemed to listen. Across the room, Mr. Whitmore's lawyer objected, claiming fabrication, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. "Let her speak," he said. Grace continued, her tone steady, but her heart trembling. "All I did was care for her," she said, "and they called it disobedience." She looked at Mr. Whitmore directly then, not with hate, but with sorrow. Sometimes the only crime a person commits is refusing to look away. Mrs. Whitmore was brought in later that afternoon, her frailty softened by quiet dignity. Gasps filled the room when she took her seat beside the prosecutor. She no longer looked like a victim, she looked like proof. When the judge asked if she had anything to say, she simply replied, "She saved my life." Grace lowered her head, tears stinging her eyes. The moment felt sacred, fragile, the final unraveling of everything cruelly hidden. The defense tried to argue that Mr. Whitmore had acted under stress, that he had intended only to help his wife. But the evidence was relentless. Forged medical reports, unauthorized drug imports, the testimonies of former employees, each piece landed like a stone in the river of his defense, pulling it under. By the end of the day, even his own lawyers looked defeated. The empire he'd built on silence had crumbled into dust. When the verdict was finally read, the room held its breath. "Guilty," the judge declared, the word cutting through the tension like sunlight through clouds. There was no applause, no outcry, just a heavy exhale that felt like justice breathing for the first time. Mr. Whitmore sat motionless, his gaze distant, as if the world around him had already moved on. Grace didn't look away. She wanted to remember this, not out of vengeance, but closure. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, flashes bursting like sparks in the afternoon air. Grace and Mrs. Whitmore slipped through the crowd quietly, escorted by Clara. People shouted questions, hungry for scandal, but Grace kept her eyes forward. She wasn't there for attention or glory. She was there because someone had to tell the truth, and she had. That was enough. Later, as they reached the car, Mrs. Whitmore squeezed Grace's hand weakly. "He can't hurt anyone anymore," she said. Grace nodded, her eyes glistening. "No," she whispered, "but the damage he caused will take time to heal." The older woman smiled faintly. Then we'll heal it together. Kin. And as they drove away from the courthouse, leaving behind the echoes of judgment and the flash of cameras, Grace finally felt something she hadn't in months: peace. Months passed like soft echoes fading through time. The scandal that once shook the city slowly became yesterday's news, replaced by newer tragedies, fresher gossip. But for Grace, life had found a quiet rhythm again, humble, steady, real. She rented a small apartment above a flower shop, where mornings smelled of bread instead of bleach and fear. Some days she still woke in the middle of the night, thinking she heard the mansion's bells. Then she'd smile, remembering they no longer rang for her. Mrs. Whitmore had recovered more than anyone dared hope. The doctors called it resilience, but Grace knew it was something stronger: freedom. They visited often, sharing tea by the window, the older woman wrapped in a soft shawl that caught the morning light. Sometimes they sat in silence, letting gratitude speak where words could not. The bond between them had outlived power, wealth, and deceit. It was forged in truth, and truth, Grace believed, never rusted. One afternoon, Mrs. Whitmore brought a small envelope tied with ribbon. "For you," she said. Inside was a letter of recommendation, elegant, handwritten, and a modest check folded beneath it. "I don't need this," Grace whispered, her throat tight. "You've already given me everything." Whitmore smiled gently. "Then use it to help someone else who's unseen." The words sank deep, like a seed finding fertile ground. Grace understood immediately. That was the woman's final gift, not money, but purpose. The next week, Grace began volunteering at a local care home. The patients were elderly, some forgotten by family, others too frail to speak. She moved among them quietly, her presence a comfort more than her words. When she brushed their hair or held their trembling hands, she remembered the touch that had once cost her everything, and how, in the end, it had saved a life. Kindness, she realized, was the only act that never truly disappeared. At night, she sometimes wrote in a small journal by candlelight. "We mistake silence for safety," one entry read, "but silence only feeds the cruel." Her handwriting was uneven, her spelling imperfect, but her words were honest, simple echoes of a truth she had lived. She wrote not to be heard, but to remember. Each page felt like stitching a wound closed, one line at a time, and slowly the ache that had followed her began to fade. Spring returned, and the world bloomed again. The lilies she planted on her windowsill grew taller each day, their white petals bending toward the light. She often caught herself smiling at them, remembering how that same flower had once smelled of poison. Now it smelled of healing. Sometimes, as she watered them, she whispered a prayer, not of fear or desperation, but gratitude. "Thank you," she'd say softly, "for the strength to see." One Sunday morning, she walked past the church she once entered in despair. Its doors were open, sunlight spilling across the pews. She paused for a long moment, then stepped inside. The same colored light painted her hands, red, gold, blue. The same warmth filled her chest, steady and familiar. She didn't pray this time. She didn't need to. Her very life had become its own prayer, one whispered through mercy, loss, and courage. Later that day, she visited Mrs. Whitmore at the rehabilitation center. The woman was sitting by a window, reading in the afternoon light. When she saw Grace, she smiled, a smile without pain, without fear. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. Grace shook her head. "No," she said, "because if I hadn't spoken, I wouldn't have lived either." They sat together in peaceful silence, two women who had survived different cages and unlocked them with the same key. As dusk fell, Grace walked home under a sky painted in gold and rose. The air smelled faintly of rain, and the city lights flickered to life one by one. She thought of all that had been lost: innocence, trust, time, and of what had been gained in their place: truth, courage, grace. The past no longer haunted her, it guided her. And when she looked up at the first evening star, she smiled, knowing she had already become who she was meant to be. Sometimes the world forgets the ones who clean its flaws, carry its burdens, and speak softly into its noise. But every now and then, one of them changes everything, not through power, but through compassion. Grace never sought to be remembered, only to do what was right. And yet, her name became the quiet echo of something greater, the reminder that love, when brave enough to see, can heal what all the doctors cannot. If you were in Grace's place, would you have risked everything for the truth? Leave your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you still believe that compassion, even when punished, is the world's greatest strength.